When you sent in airport environment officer as a career you were curious about, I have to admit the image that popped into my head was, well, someone stuck behind a desk, drowning in paperwork about carbon emissions.
It's funny how our minds jump to those conclusions.
Right. But let me tell you, after digging into this, wow, was I wrong?
What I find so fascinating about this field is that it really challenges our preconceived notions of what goes on at an airport.
It's all about the travel, the hustle and bustle, right?
Exactly. We think about catching our flights, grabbing a coffee, but behind the scenes, there's this whole other world, a hidden ecosystem at play.
And that's what we're diving into today.
Absolutely.
And thankfully, we've got RoleCatcher's career guide to help us navigate this surprisingly complex world.
It's a treasure trove of information.
It really is not just about the day-to-day, what these folks actually do, which don't worry, we'll get to, but the guide also zooms out, shows us the bigger picture of how this role impacts, well, everything.
It connects the dots in a way that I don't think most people would expect.
Plus, and this is a cool bonus for anyone actually thinking about this career path, they've got all this advice on using AI to navigate the often scary waters of the job search itself.
It really highlights how technology is changing the game, even for a field like this.
Okay, so let's unpack this airport environment officer role a bit. First things first, the guide makes it very clear. It's about way more than just emissions.
Oh, no, absolutely.
We're talking about monitoring all sorts of contamination, keeping a close watch on wildlife activity. Think about preventing those potentially disastrous bird strikes, right?
Huge issue.
And get this, studying things called environmental attractors.
Now, that's a term you don't hear every day.
I gotta be honest, that last one, I'm not gonna lie, wasn't exactly on my radar. How about you?
It's a great example of how interconnected things are in this role. See, an environmental attractor is basically anything near the airport that might draw in wildlife.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me some examples.
Well, the guide specifically mentions things like landfills.
Landfills, really?
Yeah, and wetlands. Those are big ones.
Interesting. I wouldn't have immediately thought of those as factors.
Right. But when you stop and think about it, those locations, they can attract, well, birds.
Which, as we mentioned, can be a real hazard for aircraft.
Exactly. So part of this job, a big part actually, is understanding those connections, those seemingly unrelated factors that can have a huge ripple effect.
So it's not just about identifying problems, it's about understanding this whole web of factors at play.
It's about systems thinking, for sure.
Which I guess is where this whole idea of sustainable development comes in. Something the guide mentions a lot, by the way.
Rightfully so. It's a core concept in this field.
But what does that actually mean in this context?
Yeah, it's a bit of a buzzword these days.
It gets thrown around a lot.
It does. But in this case, it's crucial because the aviation industry, let's be honest, it's under a lot of pressure to minimize its environmental footprint.
Rightfully so.
Right. So sustainable development in this context, what it really means is finding ways to keep those planes flying. Because, let's face it, air travel is pretty important these days.
It's essential for a lot of us.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's about finding ways to keep those planes flying while minimizing the impact on the surrounding environment and communities.
It's a balancing act, that's for sure.
It absolutely is. And it requires a very specific set of skills. Actually, the guide actually surprised me with some of the things it emphasized beyond, the obvious scientific background, which of course is important.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised to see reading comprehension, critical thinking, and even speaking highlighted as key skills. Honestly, I wouldn't have immediately connected those with this kind of role. So tell me more about how those skills actually come into play.
Sure. So imagine, you have to explain a complex environmental regulation.
Okay, I'm with you.
But you have to explain it to airport staff who, they may not have that same scientific background that you do. You need to be able to communicate those ideas clearly, effectively, in a way that, that they'll understand and hopefully act on.
It's about bridging that gap, right?
Yes. Or, picture yourself negotiating solutions with stakeholders. And these stakeholders, they might have very different priorities.
Yeah, you've got the airlines, the airport authorities, local residents.
Exactly. You've got to be able to think critically in those situations. You've got to understand those different perspectives. And then you have to be able to articulate your own point of view, but you have to do it in a way that fosters collaboration.
It's not just about being right. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone.
Precisely. So it's a surprisingly people-centric role, actually.
It really does sound like it takes a special kind of person, to balance that technical know-how with like those really important people
Oh,
skills.
absolutely. And speaking of different skills, this isn't a one-size-fits-all career either, RoleCatcher.
Hmm.
They actually outline 4 distinct career stages, which
Yeah.
I think really shows, the potential growth someone could have in this field.
Okay, so walk me through it. How does this career path, how does it actually unfold?
So you might start, as an entry-level officer, right? You're assisting with data collection, kind of getting a feel for the work, getting your feet wet.
That makes sense.
From there, you could move into a junior role where you'd be doing more, hardcore data analysis, preparing reports, maybe even starting to identify some of those environmental attractors that we talked about.
So you'd be the one like on a map circling those landfills or those wetland areas near the airport and saying, hey, this could be an issue.
Exactly. You got it. And then, things get even more interesting, I think, as you climb the ladder, to a mid-level position. That's where you're leading the monitoring and assessment efforts, maybe even conducting some pretty in-depth studies on the airport's environmental impact. And here's where I really got interested, that aha moment. The guide specifically mentions that mid-level officers would be studying what they call diverse contamination produced by airports.
Okay, now you've got me. I know we've said it a few times that airports, they have an environmental impact. But what exactly are we talking about here? It's not just the jet exhaust, right?
No, no, it's so much more than that, thankfully. Think about it, right? Airports have all these like unique activities and needs that frankly most of us never even think about. I mean, I know I didn't really before digging into this guide.
Right.
It really opened my eyes to just how much goes into, maintaining those environments.
So give me some examples. What are some like specific examples of this diverse contamination? Give me the insider knowledge.
Okay, one of the big ones, especially in colder climates, is de-icing fluids.
Ah, right. To keep the planes from turning into giant ice cubes.
Exactly. But those de-icing fluids, they contain chemicals, right? And those chemicals, well, they can end up in the soil and water surrounding the airport, which obviously that's not good.
Definitely not something you want leaching into the environment.
Right. Then there's the noise pollution, of course, from the aircraft themselves.
Mm.
Now, that's not a contaminant in, like, the traditional sense. It's not something you can, like, scoop up and hold in your hand.
But it still has a huge impact on, local communities, wildlife, the whole ecosystem, really.
Huge impact. And then we can't forget about the whole waste disposal issue, right, from the planes and just the airport operations in general.
Oh, right. Everything that happens at an airport, it's like a small city, basically.
Exactly. So you've got everything from, food waste to, like, hazardous materials that need to be disposed of properly. And it's a real challenge, to manage all of that in a way that minimizes environmental harm.
It's a side of airports I honestly never even considered, It's just like, get in, get to your gate, get out. But it's actually pretty incredible how much goes on behind the scenes to keep things running smoothly and safely, not just for the travelers, but for the environment, too.
It really is. And that's what
Yeah.
makes this career, I think, so important. Now, imagine, reaching the pinnacle, right? You're a senior airport environmental officer.
Yeah.
You're overseeing that entire environmental management process. You're conducting extensive research. You're working with regulatory bodies. You're implementing long-term sustainability plans. You're like the go-to person for all things environmental at the airport.
Wow. Talk about a career with real impact. You'd be shaping the future of sustainable aviation literally from the ground up.
And that's where RoleCatcher, they take things a step further, which I thought was really cool.
Oh.
How's-
Oh.
They've actually integrated some really cool AI tools into their platform that, they can actually help you land a job in this field, which we know can be very competitive.
Now, knowing our listeners, they're probably just as interested in this AI angle as I am. So break it down for us. What are we talking about here? What can these tools actually do?
Well, remember those automated recruiting systems we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
The ones that scan your resume for keywords and stuff?
Oh, yeah, those things.
Yeah, so RoleCatcher, they've got tools that can actually analyze those job descriptions, those very specific job descriptions, and they can identify the exact skills that the employers are looking for.
So it's like having like a secret decoder ring for job postings.
Exactly. And then here's the really cool part. They use that information to help you tailor your CV or resume.
Mm-hmm.
to highlight those very specific skills that we know the employers are looking for, which means you're way more likely to actually be seen by a real person.
So it's like having an AI career coach in your corner, giving you that extra edge in what can be, like you said, a very, very competitive job market.
Precisely. And it gets even better. They even have AI-powered interview practice tools.
Oh, wow. Really? Tell me.
Yeah. So these tools, they actually analyze your performance in like a mock interview setting. They
Yeah.
give you feedback on your answers, and I think most importantly, they can help you project that sense of confidence and competence that, can make all the difference in an interview.
That's incredibly useful, especially, in a field like this where you're dealing with, complex technical information, you're dealing with stakeholders, you're negotiating solutions. It's like having a practice run before the big game.
Exactly. And honestly, I think it just goes to show that RoleCatcher really gets it.
Mhm.
They understand that the job market is more competitive than ever, and they're really trying to empower job seekers
Hmm.
with these really cutting edge tools and resources.
Which is something I know our listeners really appreciate. But before we get too far down the AI rabbit hole, which let's be honest is tempting,
Mm,
I want to bring it back to the core of what an airport environmental officer does. We've talked about the responsibilities, the skills, the career progression, but I want to circle back to this idea of sustainable development that the guide kept mentioning. And I'm still curious about what that actually looks like in the context of, a real live busy airport.
yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that's honestly it's becoming more and more important as the aviation industry grows, and more and more people rely on air travel.
So paint me a picture. What does sustainable development actually look like, when you're standing there on the ground at an airport?
Well, it's not just one thing, that's for sure. It's multifaceted. It's a lot of different moving parts. But I guess for starters, it means reducing the airport's own carbon footprint as much as possible.
Okay, that makes sense. Less of an impact overall.
Right. And that could involve, investing in renewable energy sources. We're talking solar panels, wind turbines, things like that to try to offset the airport's, pretty massive energy consumption.
So powering those huge terminals, all those lights, the baggage handling systems, everything, powering it more sustainably.
Exactly. And it's not just the buildings themselves either. Airports are, they're constantly looking for ways to optimize those flight routes to try to minimize fuel consumption as much as possible. Even like redesigning the infrastructure of the airport itself to make it more energy efficient.
Wow, I never really thought about like the design of the airport making a difference in terms of sustainability.
Well, we can make a huge difference. And, all those little things, they might seem small on their own, but they really do add up.
So it's about thinking about the big picture, but also sweating the small stuff, those little details that can make a real difference.
Absolutely. And, it extends to the planes themselves, too. Sustainable development also means encouraging those airlines to use more sustainable aviation fuels.
Oh, right, like those biofuels we hear about instead of the traditional jet fuel.
Exactly. So,
Right.
again, it's about that holistic approach from like the ground operations to what's happening, up in the air.
Okay, that makes sense. But we talked earlier about those environmental attractors and those surrounding communities, and I'm wondering how those factor into sustainable development because that's a whole other layer, isn't it?
No, it's a huge part of it. Being a good neighbor is a big part of sustainability for airports. So we're talking about, trying to minimize the impact on those residents who, live near the airport.
Right, because it's easy to forget about that when you're just focused on, catching your flight and getting where you need to go.
Absolutely. So, they're looking at ways to reduce that noise pollution from the aircraft. They're looking at ways to improve the public transportation links to and from the airport to try to cut down on, those cars on the road.
Hmm.
Some airports are even like preserving those green spaces around the airport to act as buffers between, the airport itself and those residential areas.
So it's really about trying to like fit the airport into the existing environment in a way that's sustainable, both for, the people and the surrounding ecosystems.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, that harmony,
Yeah.
and it's not always easy.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty tough job when you really think about it. Trying to balance, the benefits of air travel, keeping people connected with the need to protect the planet. It's a lot of responsibility.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's something that, after doing all this research with you, it really makes you appreciate the work that these folks are doing.
They're the unsung heroes of, making sure we can keep exploring the world without destroying it in the process.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This deep dive has been, it's been really eye-opening, to say the least. I had no idea the world of an airport environment officer was so dynamic, so important, and honestly, so cool. Big thanks to our expert for taking us behind the scenes. And for our listeners, if you want to learn more about this fascinating career path, don't forget to check out the show notes for links to RoleCatcher's career guide and all those other cool resources that we talked about. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.